morning, and welcome to the latest edition of the Mormon Center for Space Studies SpaceTime interview series. My name is Chris Williams, and I have the privilege of serving as chair of the Mormon Center, the independent think tank housed within the National Security Space Association. The Mormon Center is named in honor of the late General Tom Mormon, who is a great leader and friend and mentor to many, myself included. We deeply appreciate the continued support of the Mormon family to the important work of the association. You can find previous SpaceTime interviews, as well as links to our book called Contested Space, and other publications on the NSSA website, which is nssaspace.org. Just click on the Mormon Center link for more resources. Today's SpaceTime topic is Space Contributions to Operation Epic Fury. U.S. national security space forces have been deeply integrated in the planning for and conduct of the high-intensity military operations against Iran. As our viewers are aware, a ceasefire was announced just yesterday. Secretary of War Hegseth stated that Operation Epic Fury involved comprehensive strikes from, quote, seabed to space and cyberspace, end quote, to dismantle various Iranian capabilities. He described the operation as utilizing, quote, every tool of AI, of cyber, of space, electronic warfare, counter unmanned aerial systems, blinding, confusing, and deceiving our enemy, end quote. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Kane, asserted, quote, the first movers were U.S. Cybercom and U.S. Spacecom, layering non-kinetic effects, disrupting and degrading Iran's ability to see, communicate, and respond, end quote. And Commander of U.S. Central Command, Admiral Cooper, stated, quote, a note about the Space Force. Our space superiority has been a critical enabler to this fight. Unseen by the world, the Space Force is doing two things. First, they are degrading Iranian capability, and second, they are helping to protect American forces, end quote. These and other statements from senior U.S. officials underscore the vital role that America's national security space forces play in modern warfare. This morning, we are honored to have with us two highly distinguished national security space practitioners, Lieutenant General John Shaw, U.S. Space Force retired, and Dr. Sean Kirkpatrick, to discuss space contributions to Operation Epic Fury. Gentlemen, welcome. Lieutenant General Shaw retired from the U.S. Space Force on November 1, 2023. Prior to his retirement, he served as the Deputy Commander, U.S. Space Command. Before that, Lieutenant General Shaw was dual-hatted as the Commander, Combined Forces Space Component Command, U.S. Space Command, and as the First Commander, Space Operations Command, U.S. Space Force, located at Vandenberg Air Force Base in California. He also served as the Deputy Commander of Air Force Space Command, part of U.S. Space Force, and among other important roles over the course of his distinguished career. Dr. Sean Kirkpatrick brings decades of experience and expertise in scientific and technical intelligence, research and development, acquisitions, and defense and intelligence operations, specializing in space and counterspace mission areas. He previously led the intelligence community in the establishment of the National Space Defense Center in SDC, and served as the Deputy Director of Intelligence at U.S. Space Command, where he played a central role in standing up the command's intelligence functions and organizations. He also served as the Deputy Director for Intelligence at U.S. Strategic Command and in many other key DoD and IC space-related positions. Thanks to you both for sharing your valued perspectives with us today. One last bit of housekeeping. For our viewers, please feel free to propose questions to our speakers. Just click the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. I'll get to as many of your questions as possible in the 60 minutes we have allotted for today's interview. Let's start with some questions for General Shaw. Sir, how have both Space Command and the U.S. Space Force contributed to the planning for and conduct of Operation Epic Fury? And what are some of the key missions that both organizations performed in wartime? And before you get to the questions, if you have any opening comments, John, you'd like to make, please feel free to do so.
Well, thanks, Chris. Thanks for having us here today. Thanks for doing this on behalf of the Mormon Center, and also thanks for having Dr. Kirkpatrick as part of this too. He and I worked together a few times over our careers at two different
once or twice.
Yeah, and so I'm glad you have him here too to provide a lot of the insight into the intelligence community contributions, which are vital and increasingly vital in how we do space operations. I would say so. I have to start with the obvious, and we could go on, but this could be very, very long, right? In terms of of how Space Command and Space Force have supported Epic Fury, you have to start with the space support pieces, right? As CENTCOM was putting together its plan, probably heavily led by the air component, as this was largely an air operation, but also supported by the maritime component and, of course, the entire headquarters and all the things that a combatant command brings together. As Central Command was putting that plan together, almost every facet of it relies on space somehow, right? If you want to make sure that you have the optimized GPS signal available to you as you're starting to conduct operations. You want to make sure you have your primary, your alternate, your contingency, your emergency communications capabilities, many of which flow through space. Missile warning. We knew going into this that Iran was going to respond with missile threats to the region, just as they had done last year, and we saw that happen. And you need those missile warning capabilities in space to be able to detect, track, warn, and cue the missile defense capabilities that we had in theater. I could go on and on. All those space support things have to be postured, and you can bet that there were some long hours at U.S. Space Command. There were some long hours in parts of the Space Force, to include the component there in Central Command, leading up to the initial operations to make sure all of those capabilities were ready. And so that's the big of it. I think you'll probably get a little bit later to some offensive pieces, so I'll wait on that, on how to describe that. But I think it's remarkable, especially in the last year, how much leadership has talked about the need for space and the importance of space in key operations. Operation Midnight Hammer last year, the Venezuelan operation at the beginning of this year, and now Epic Fury. And those remarks, Chris, are being said by non-space leaders. That's exceptionally remarkable. You know, in some ways, I think air power kind of reached its day in World War II, when career land and maritime commanders talked about the importance of air power and the need for air support before they could do anything. That was in World War II, right? Once career land and maritime started talking about that, you realize that it was playing a key and vital role. And I feel like we've sort of hit an inflection point here on the reliance and need for space in modern warfare, that other military leaders are acknowledging it, that we need that. We need it first, we need it up front, and without it, we're in big trouble.
Thank you very much for that. As a follow-on, can you describe how the process by which CENTCOM and SpaceCom coordinated their plans and operations? How does that cross-command coordination and integration happen in practice, because of the exquisite nature of the timing of various activities, et cetera? I mean, this really is a major undertaking to coordinate these activities and provide support at the right time in the right place, et cetera. So can you talk a little bit about how that happens in practice?
Yeah, Chris, I think I would slightly rephrase your question, and that when you say U.S. CENTCOM, we maybe think about the headquarters, and Space Command, we think about the headquarters, but there's coordination going on lots of levels.
Mhm.
So at the Combatant Command headquarters level, yeah, there is consistent crosstalk between Space Command and all the combat commands all the time for all the plans that they're putting into place or putting on the shelf. That's going on continuously. And that's primarily done through liaisons. We have what we call joint integration space teams that are U.S. Space Command personnel embedded in the combatant command headquarters at that highest level, and usually working with the J3 and the J5 on their plans and potential operations to make sure that U.S. Space Command can be the best supporting combatant command to CENTCOM or EUCOM or INDOPACOM that they can possibly be. So you have a layer going on at the combatant command level. But at the same time, you have an increasingly important and growing layer going on at the operation level. We have a Space Force component in U.S. Central Command. It's headquartered in Tampa, where U.S. Central Command is headquartered, but there's a lot of those folks are also deployed into theater. They're working at the operational level, Chris. They're working with the other components within CENTCOM to make sure that those components, as they're working their schemes and maneuver as part of the overall plan, have the space capabilities they need at the right time and right place to do that. And they're also reaching back, that component is reaching back to the Space Command Space Force component, which is Space Force's space out at Vandenberg, now Vandenberg Space Force Base. And that was the organization that I led in my penultimate job on active duty that you mentioned in the intro, working with the Combined Space Operations Center and with the National Space Defense Center as needed to coordinate at the operational level. And then we actually have space experts embedded down in actual operational units, whether it's maritime or down in the Air Operations Center and such that are doing that same thing. So really, what we have is not a simple like linear process, but an ecosystem of space expertise plugged in where it needs to be to make sure that the space capabilities that are needed to prosecute that campaign are there. And there is an element too that's also looking at, hey, what threats might be present or being focused on or targeting the space domain itself.
Hmm.
And it's possible, and we see this mostly when we think about EUCOM and INDOPACOM scenarios, that U.S. Space Command would need to be a supported command in order to protect those capabilities or go after adversary space capabilities that are affecting that terrestrial fight. So again, I think I just scratched the surface. The idea here is to give you the complexity of that ecosystem that only continues to grow. And that's what we should expect. Space is more important today than it was yesterday, and it'll be more important tomorrow.
Absolutely. And just to follow on to that, John, give us a sense of the rough order of magnitude number of people that are involved in that. I mean, how many people are forward deployed, say at Al Udeid or in Tampa and other places at headquarters and at U.S. Space Command, and the magnitude of the effort of putting together the air tasking orders and other things along those lines is tremendous. But in terms of the space support, what's the order of magnitude of people that are on the ground every day, helping inform those decisions and operations?
Well, I mean, even if I knew the exact numbers, I don't think I would want to mention them here,
Sure.
but we can probably safely say they're in the hundreds to maybe even thousands. And that's globally. Peel the onion back further. I am fairly certain that the space components in INDOPACOM and European Command, the Space Force space components inside those commands, were probably helping too,
Hmm.
saying, "Hey, where do we help? Where can we be supporting?"
Hmm.
And so again, it's a global fight when you try to bring all the space capabilities. Space is inherently, as I like to say, not only global but supra global, and
Right.
so you can't do it all. You can't optimize it unless you're leveraging all of it.
And one other related question. We talk about and worry about simultaneous crises or conflicts in different regions. In this case, we had a focus on just Iran and the CENTCOM AOR, obviously extending to space because space is involved as well. Do we have the people to be able to conduct multiple simultaneous crises or conflicts like that? I mean, you talked about the number of people involved. How much would a multi-regional crisis set of crises or conflicts really tax the number of people we have? And in part, I'm trying to get at the end, poking at the issue that General Saltzman has raised about the need to increase the top line number of space guardians that we have.
Yeah, well, first, let me talk about how you would address that multi uh, threat scenario or adversary scenario. And that falls largely on U.S. Space Command, right? Because that is the one combat command that is supporting all other combatant commands simultaneously. And in order to coordinate, synchronize, synergize, and optimize all those in that sort of situation, that's something U.S. Space Command is going to do, and probably largely through its components,
Hmm.
not just S4S, Space Forces Space. Will involve the Navy and Army and even Marine Space Force, Space Command components. Um, but that's where that would happen. That's
Hmm.
U.S. Space Command's job. By the way, we shouldn't be surprised to hear that, right? It's the same thing for U.S. Transcom. If you
Hmm.
had a multi-fight, adversary fight going on, U.S. Transcom is the one trying to figure out how do I support all these
Right.
simultaneously with whatever I have. And
Absolutely.
so that shouldn't surprise us, but that's how that plays. As opposed to, well, now you're asking me, as an operator and a commander, I'm always going to be unsatisfied with the resources I have. So you set up a softball for me. Of course, we need more.
Yes.
We need more. We need more resources. We need more uh, uh, workforce and we need deeper technical expertise. And all these things are going to have to grow to keep pace with the importance that space is playing, not only in joint warfighting, but in our society and for our planet. And now, as we've seen this week, illustrated for the Earth-Moon system. And
Right.
so are we right-sized for that in terms of resources, in terms of either proportion to other expenses and or in a relative sense or absolute sense? I suspect the answer is no. So how do we get there?
Thank you. And one last question for you, John, and then we'll turn to Dr. Kirkpatrick. Both General Kane and Admiral Cooper highlighted the importance of offensive space control operations. How have U.S. military space forces helped to degrade Iranian capability, and how do such actions enhance U.S. military operations?
Yeah, we've heard a lot about this in the press, and I sure hope we can get more details out to people on this because it's some sensitive activity. I think I would start by saying, the conflict that Epic Fury most resembles in modern times, I think, is probably the Kosovo conflict in 1999. And I'll just a few ways why I think that's true. There's many, but so we're fighting an adversary that doesn't have anywhere near the air capability that we have, doesn't have anywhere near the space capability we have. This was true of Serbia as it is of Iran today, but they do have some capability. We have to be cognizant of that and ready for it. And why did I think of this? As I saw the amazing rescue play out over this past week of the downed airmen, I immediately was reminded because Captain Shaw was working in the Air Operations Center in Europe during Kosovo. 17 go down, or when we actually had Fingers Goldfeins F-16 go down, it was all hands on deck, including what space could bring to bear. Nobody slept until those pilots were recovered. And I know that's exactly what played out here. And there were probably some of these things that were referenced by General Kane and Admiral Cooper were going on not only at the beginning of Epic Fury, but during this rescue attempt. To give a picture of what this is likely entailing, I like to say that space and cyber are BFFs. They're besties. And it did not surprise me at all. In fact, it would have surprised me. I think if you look at the comments, they tended to say, these leaders tended to talk about U.S. Space Command and U.S. Cybercom together. And so many things we can do in the cyber environment can interfere with an enemy's ability to understand what's going on, to communicate, and to get a sight picture. And many of those pathways or information flows and such flow through space, even for an adversary like Iran today, or even like Serbia in 1999 and others like that. So they are using it to some extent. So the extent that you can get in there and affect that, and you need to give this question to Dr. Kirkpatrick because he'll talk to it with much more authority. But that's how to think about this: is how does information flow? How does spectrum work? And what domains does it flow through? A lot of it's space. And then so how do you address that to deprive the adversary of its capabilities while at the same time preserving your capabilities? So I hope we get more details on that so we better understand that linkage between space and cyber in the future. But that's how I think the best way to start thinking about it.
Well, thank you. And it is noteworthy that senior officials were touting, one of the first things they said in their opening briefings after the conflict began was the value of space. And that's good to hear from them, that they appreciate it, they understand it along those lines.
Chris, one more thought on that. I referenced back to World War II and the emergence of the need for air superiority to enable, land and maritime operations happened right around then, right? I mean, that's when we started to really see that happen. What you're seeing now is the next phase, where in order to really for terrestrial operations to happen efficiently, effectively, you need to first establish some form of space superiority and address that first.
Right.
And so, again, we should not be surprised. This is how other domains have worked out, and now we're seeing this for space.
That's great. Thank you very much. Let's turn to Dr. Kirkpatrick. Sean, please tell us more about the roles and missions of the key intelligence organizations across the DoD and the IC, including the NRO, the Defense Intelligence Agency, the National Space Intelligence Center, NSA, as well as the role of the U.S. Space Command J2 organization that you helped stand up a number of years ago, and its relationship to U.S. CENTCOM J2. How do those various national and defense intelligence organizations coordinate their activities in order to enable the high op tempo of U.S. military forces in areas such as identifying targets, providing battle damage assessment, and more? How does all that come together from your previous perch in the J2 shop, for example?
Thanks, Chris. I appreciate it. Appreciate being here. Really appreciate being here with John. We've had the privilege of working together for many years, and so it pains me to actually have to say I think General Shaw had a good thing to say here on the complexity of what you just laid out. And I'm gonna steal his quote of it is an ecosystem, and very much like what he described as far as the different layers of the command and the components and the embedded personnel. The intelligence community is very similar to that. What a lot of people who maybe don't have experience in a combatant command don't recognize is that the entire intelligence community has a presence with the command, embedded with the command. Those national agency teams are stood up to grow specific innate capabilities that occur at the command. They also provide reach back to their home agencies and capabilities for on-demand needed surge support and capabilities. So things like tasking of overhead ISR, or national technical means, that is coordinated through either NGA or NSA, depending on if we're talking about SIGINT or GEOINT. And those are coordinated with and among the combatant commands and the tasking elements in there to ensure that there's a balance of priorities. So much like the question you asked about multi-conflicts, just because we have a conflict going on right now in the Middle East and we are surging support for overhead intelligence collection to there, does not mean the rest of the world can be ignored, and we have to continue to do that kind of monitoring and tasking. So there's a balance there. That balance is both automated and manual, depending on where you are in the system. And that's one of the things I think we'll talk about a little bit later is how that's changed. And then the data fusion and the analysis comes through all that. And again, we'll touch on that a little bit more later. I think what's important to understand for things like NRO, NRO is a little unique in that they operate the systems, but they build the systems. So they are an acquisition organization, but they are also combat support when needed. And so they help coordinate a lot of the flying and the tasking and whatnot. But the prioritization of that tasking comes through NGA or NSA for SIGINT and GEOINT and whatnot. NSIC, the National Space Intelligence Center, which is the intelligence S&T organization, S&TI organization for Space Force, is primarily focused on foundational intelligence. They do provide operational support. They provide the reach back to the command or to the organizational components as needed, but they don't run a 24/7 ops center like our ops centers at the commands and at the components. They offer surge support when necessary, so reach back when necessary. The NSA, NGA, I think as we talked about, provide not only that tasking, but they do the INW, they provide the BDA, they provide that data through their embedded elements at the commands and at the components, and then operationalize that data and integrate it. The J2s do exactly the same as the other J3s and J5s at the headquarters level, as well as down as you go down into the S2s. Their coordination occurs through both standing processes and battle accelerated battle rhythms in which, at the different levels, they are coordinating intelligence and tasking. I think the other thing that's worth noting, because a lot of people, when I tell them this, have this look of surprise on their face. Uh, all combatant commands, the J2 civilian personnel, and a good portion of the military personnel are all DIA personnel. So the Defense Intelligence Agency is the premier military intelligence support agency for the combatant commands. And you can almost look at them as a organized, train, and equip for the intelligence community, for the intelligence components, for the intelligence functions of the combatant commands at the joint level. And so that's where they come into play.
Thank you. U.S. and Israeli intelligence organizations have been closely watching Iranian behavior for many years, of course. How would you grade U.S. and Israeli intelligence in terms of identifying the locations of key leaders, weapon system disposition, et cetera, and how much of the success that we saw in terms of military aspects of the campaign is due to exquisite human intelligence sources versus, say, signals intelligence, SIGINT, or overhead imagery, et cetera? How would you sort of weigh the different inputs to the broader intelligence picture?
Sure. So in general, um, HUMINT is not a battle time operational input, right? They are there to give you essentially the pre-targeting, the lead up to the intelligence, the exquisite intelligence on intentions, disposition of both forces as well as personnel, key personnel. Um, it is a rare occurrence, but it does happen when during a strike, human intelligence is used to validate uh, either the target or the BDA afterwards. But that is rare because it's not timely. You can't usually get a human source to get on a phone and call into the ops center. That's just not how that works. Um, SIGINT and GEOINT, on the other hand, are usually at machine speeds. So once you have that exquisite intelligence that says, "Hey, a week from now, key leadership is going to be all in this one place or in these two places," then when that week comes around or that time comes around, and leading up to it and afterwards, you will see a surge in GEOINT SIGINT support, cyber support, that will provide the timely exquisite intelligence that is necessary for targeting and for BDA and for positive ID and all the things that are required before weapons is released.
Thank you. Back to General Shaw. John, recognizing that U.S. military operations were recently paused as a result of the ceasefire, what lessons should one derive from Operation Epic Fury in order to better position the U.S. to combat potential Chinese aggression against Taiwan or the Philippines? I mean, what are some of the big things you see, and how does our performance in this case, in your mind, how does that influence the perceptions of, say, the Chinese or the Russians or others?
Yeah, well, let me start with that last piece first. I think, there's a lot of opinions that say, hey, China is going to see this as ways they can be more aggressive or have more sovereignty in their part of the world and things like that. I actually think that there's another dynamic that's like, wow, I don't know if we can do what the U.S. can do. That was pretty amazing what they did with Midnight Hammer and what they did in Venezuela and what how quickly they got rid of the Iranian Navy and such. And I think it actually makes them maybe pause a little bit about, I don't know if we're ready. And so I'm all for that. So I believe that there is a positive deterrent piece here in the minds of China, and same for Russia. Same for Russia. Like, we're going to have trouble competing. Um, Hey, let me be a little provocative on the main answer here, though. I think because I think there will be some good lessons that we learn on how to integrate space even better into terrestrial operations. But what we shouldn't do is take wrong lessons away.
Mhm.
When we, there's been talk about, quote, we had space superiority. And that's true. I mean, the basic definition of space superiority is being able to use space the way you want to, and to deny your adversary the way to use space the way they want to. And to the extent that Iran uses space, that's true. And to the extent that we use space, we've been able to kind of do what we want to do. But I grew up, I spent 30 years as an airman before I went to the US Space Force. And I think I can speak on behalf of air doctrine folks that you won't want to take lessons away from Serbia or the war on terror on air superiority and apply them to China.
Mhm.
It's a totally different situation. And so what we shouldn't do is take away and say, hey, space superiority is easy. All we got to do is a lot of things and we got this.
Right.
No, and by the way, the Air Force knows that. That's why they want that next generation uh, fighter aircraft and air dominance and so on. And they know this. And we need to know it too, that if we go into a fight with China or even with Russia, we're going to get attacked in space.
Mhm.
The ability for Iran to affect our space capabilities is limited. They could do some jamming, GPS jamming, SATCOM jamming, and such. Their ability to reach out into space is extremely, extremely limited.
Mhm.
Um, that is not the case for potential peer adversaries. So I think I would just, obviously, if there's more questions in the Q&A period about this, I would just say, one of the lessons to take away is don't take away any lessons about superiority that we learn here that are likely not to be applicable against a peer adversary.
Thank you. And Sean, what stands out to you as some of the greatest accomplishments of the national and defense intelligence enterprises in terms of both preparation for and conduct of both Operation Midnight Hammer and Epic Fury? And where might some improvements be made? I know this is, we're still fresh on the ceasefire having been announced, et cetera. But what do you see from your vantage point as to some of the not only tremendous accomplishments, but where could we do better?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I've got a couple of observations. One, I just want to emphasize what John said. Let's not take away, lessons learned, and that is very applicable to the intelligence community. Iran is a very different intelligence target than China, and so some of that exquisite intelligence and information we had on Iran, we're probably not going to have for China, or it's going to be not as timely. And so those lessons are absolutely not 100% applicable at all. Um, what do I see as been good progress? Really, as we've increased our tactical use of NTM, the integration of those data streams, the automation of analysis and AI-enabled targeting and whatnot, tipping and queuing, indications and warning, those have all come a long, long way. And here's a primary example of this, and this sort of blurs the line between J2 and J3 functions. But this conflict, I believe, is the first time we have used AI-enabled missile track analysis and messaged that out and put a weapon on that and done it in an automated fashion. Um, like that is a very big step that we have not done before, and we did it with capabilities that existed for more strategic purposes, but accelerated that integration and implementation in about a 6-month period of time. And I think that's just a really good example of, hey, this is how this is what the future could look like, right? This is how we could do this. Now, where do we have some places for improvement? Well, we still have challenges with integrating those disparate data streams. And I really don't see nearly as much integration of commercial capabilities as leadership claims to want. All right. And that we keep saying and harping on, there are commercial capabilities that could be integrated directly into some of this, our weapon systems. And it's not all there yet. It's just not as far along as I think we wanted it to be. And I think we have a ways to go on that.
Thank you. Obviously, one important element of the campaign is the missile defense side of the house and the effective defenses that were provided both for U.S. forces in the region and also populations, the Israeli populations, et cetera. What's your take? I ask each of you, what's your take on the current state of missile defense technology, how it was applied in this particular case in the region, and what are the lessons from that for General Gutlein to take away and his team in terms of constructing Golden Dome for America? John, you want to go first?
Yeah, I mean, you opened up a really large topic that we could go into. I'll just hit a couple
Well, I
things.
only have 4 more hours, so
Yeah. Well, I think one thing by the way, there's overlap here between what we've seen in the Ukraine Russia war, what we've seen in Epic Fury. But there's also a segment we haven't seen, and that's the more strategic kinds of threats to the homeland and such. So it's a spectrum, and that's kind of part of my answer. Is I think one of the things we're learning is to counter today's aerial threats or suborbital threats. You need a layered set of defenses of various kinds of capabilities. Some are going to be high-end capabilities that can go after suborbital missiles that are moving very, very quickly over long distances. But that's not cost-effective against the cheap drones. So you need another layer of cheap interceptors, and Ukraine has done a good job of this, to be cost-effective against the cheap drones. And I think that's the intellectual space we're exploring, is how do you do this layering in a cost-effective way that actually can be effective and actually deter someone from attacking you, because they can't get a lot of their capability through, and it's going to cost them more than it's going to cost you to defend. That would be the beginning of a good discussion about that.
All right. Sean?
Yeah, I agree with what John just said. And I think to take it one step further, we should, if somebody's not doing this, then bad on us, but we ought to be collating the statistics for how many of those intercepts are successful, both from a drone and from a missile attack. And then look at that as a benchmark for, okay, this is our starting point. How do we get this better if we need to get it better? And from a deterrence perspective, some version of that needs to be made public, or at least needs to be made knowledgeable to our adversaries, right? So deterrence doesn't do you any good if you don't demonstrate you can actually do this. So there's a piece of that I think we need to take into account.
And without question, in my mind, one of the key takeaways is the importance of even imperfect missile defenses and drone defenses to helping keep a coalition together. That's absolutely imperative. And if some of the skeptics back in the day, the SDI days, for example, had their way, we wouldn't have the kinds of missile defenses that we're operating very effectively, not 100% leak proof, but nonetheless saving lives every day and protecting property, et cetera. So any thoughts on that, John?
I would just say I would have to really struggle to find any example in history of a defense that was leak proof.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, that's just warfare. You make it hard. You don't make it, it's hard to make it impossible, but you just make it hard, and you make the cost benefit not work. And that's what deterrence is about, right? You impose costs and deny benefits. And that's how we need to be thinking about missile defense.
And raise questions in the mind of the adversary as to whether they can actually accomplish their objectives. And every day they say, not today, that's a good day. And whether that's offensive forces capabilities or defensive forces that contribute to that, it's the sum total. John, let me read a quote to both of you here. SpaceCom Commander General Whiting just last week gave testimony on the Hill, and give you an excerpt from his testimony. He said, To deter our potential adversaries and maintain superiority in space, U.S. Spacecom is advocating for a critical strategic shift from a predictable static posture to dynamic maneuver warfare. The core of this new operational focus is to operate our space assets with the same freedom of action as forces in the air, on land, and at sea, thereby complicating adversary targeting, creating uncertainty and imposing risk on any potential aggressor. He went on to say, however, true maneuver warfare cannot be achieved as long as our on-orbit platforms are constrained by the finite resources they carry at launch. This limiting factor creates a psychology of scarcity, constraining a commander's willingness to use assets dynamically, limiting our ability to conduct real-world training, and inhibiting the full benefits of mission command. A robust in-domain logistics network would enable sustained space maneuver and ensure operational superiority. Just as the joint forces are replenished on the move in other domains, sustaining our warfighting platforms in orbit would begin with advancing on-orbit refueling and extend to leveraging in-space servicing, assembly, and manufacturing technologies to enhance resilience and flexibility. He concluded with, our operational intent is to mature these technologies to enable maneuver warfare in space, a capability essential for sustaining our advantage in space, end quote. Along these lines, you recently published a terrific article in Forbes. I'd strongly encourage our viewers to take a look at it. It's called The Age of Space Maneuver in Warfare is Imminent. And in this regard, what capabilities are needed to implement the concept of maneuver warfare in space? Let me just start with that, and then I have a couple of follow-on questions for you.
Chris, I think we're going to need a whole nother session or maybe a series of them to really get at this. And by the way, I'm glad Dr. Kirkpatrick is here. He and I have talked about this at length. And I'm sensitive we want to get to some Q&A. Let me sum it up by saying I think we're on the brink of a paradigm shift on how we think about space warfare, military space. And Stephen sort of outlined that in his statement. We have been up to this point, and almost my entire career, we focused on space support as what we did as military space professionals. We made sure that special ops team on the ground or that ship at sea had everything it needed to be able to do its job using space capabilities drilling down. But this paradigm shift is now a realization, by the way, we need to keep doing all that. Don't get me wrong. In fact, it's getting more and more important of things from space. But there's a realization that we're going to face adversaries that are going to try to deprive us of those capabilities in space, and they're going to use their own space capabilities against us. And so now the center of gravity, literally, in a sense, is shifting into the space domain of where we need to focus the primacy of our efforts. And that battle space is getting bigger. I mean, we can talk about cislunar at some point, and Artemis really brought that to our imaginations, I think, this past weekend. It's just the beginning of what we'll see. So if you need to be able to do things in space now rather than space support, which can be done with what I call positional space operations platforms that don't really maneuver, they stay in their orbits and they deliver things down to the Earth. If you need to now maneuver in the domain against threats in the domain, and that domain, that battle space is getting bigger and bigger all the time. It's really stretching to be the Earth-Moon system. You have to now be able to maneuver in that environment. You can't do it the old way of just launching a satellite and leaving it in an orbit or doing very minor energy changes over its lifetime that equate to small drift as opposed to active maneuver. And Stephen hit another important thing, the psychologically of scarcity. I think to try to give an example of that, and it's massively imperfect, so just ask the audience to indulge me. There's a difference between a World War I approach of telling a platoon commander, hey, just man this trench. Just stay there, direct some fires and support, maybe if you need to or whatever, but just stay there, okay? That platoon commander gets the orders, but there's not a lot they're going to do. Right? And not what they're going to feel empowered to do. They just got to do that. Contrast that with a tank platoon commander in early World War II, who gets a kind of a lot of open intent of what you need to go do to get behind the enemy and encircle them and keep pushing and get to their rear areas and such. That's empowering. And so when we talk about mission command and the psychology of space warfighting, we're going to have to get to that, and we're not there right now. And that's what we're going to have to get to. That's the psychological piece that Stephen's talking about. Psychological scarcity means I don't have the ability to do that, so I got to hoard what I have. But if I have the ability, I can do a whole lot more. That's just
Thank you.
scratching the surface of so much.
Understand.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Sean.
So both Stephen and John, have some great points on what the future of that looks like. But I would also say there are two things that need to be done concurrently with those developments, or else those futures don't happen. And there's no logistics, there's no enablers without them. And that is time dominant space domain awareness and the associated machine to machine on orbit or beyond data analysis and autonomy, because without that, you're not going to know what's going on. You can't go dock with something. You can't see who else is out there. You have to have a lot of this already done or automated, because you're not going to have the time to collect all that data in cislunar and send it back and get it analyzed and then push commands out to autonomous systems that are going to be moving around and trying to do things. And I think the other piece of this that should not be underestimated on its long-term impacts to global space exploration beyond GEO is PNT, and who is going to set the standards for navigation and timing, and how is that going to come about? Because right now, China is trying to push in those international forums for their own model, their own timing standards, their own navigation standards. And if the US does not participate and do that, then we run the risk of the rest of the world doing their own thing, and that will have impacts on, of course, interoperability and how we're going to deal with all of our allies and commercial partners. So there's an issue there, and I know NASA just was working on a study for this, but I think we need to go faster and need to go harder.
Yeah,
Hey,
thank
Chris,
you.
I
Go ahead.
like Dr. Kirkpatrick's time dominant adjective there. That is a piece that's missing. We do space domain awareness today. We put a lot of emphasis on tracking objects, but we track them in a positional perspective, right? We track what static orbit they're in, and as soon as they maneuver, that track doesn't work anymore. Time dominant is, I think, Sean, I'm speaking for your term there, but I think it speaks to the fact that you can't do this in a deliberate fashion. Hey, I saw it here, I'm going to see it tomorrow over here. No, you need to be continuously tracking and updating that in real time, almost a fire control approach, to be able to keep up in the future.
Absolutely.
So I agree with everything that Sean said.
In that regard, it's noteworthy that several years in a row, the commander of U.S. Spacecom said space domain awareness was his #1 priority and his #1 shortfall. Eventually, we need to fix that, and the sooner the better, obviously. Let me shift to a couple of questions from the audience. The first one is, would enjoy hearing from the panelists their thoughts about efforts to limit U.S. commercial satellite imagery from being released when there are plentiful non-U.S. commercial satellite imagery available to adversaries. How do we thread the needle on that? John, you want to go first, or Sean?
I'll go first because I'm going to turn it right over to Dr. Kirkpatrick. That's more in his. By the way, I agree with the way the question was teed up. If U.S. companies were the only ones producing imagery, commercial imagery, yeah, then it makes sense. I can probably deprive an adversary or others who might be supporting my adversary from getting it. As this proliferates and becomes a global commodity provided by so many different sources and such, I don't know how effective that is and how realistic it is. So I think we have to think about this, but I don't have a solution. I'm just trying to define that problem better, and I think the person who asked the question kind of did. So, Dr. Kirkpatrick, what's the answer?
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head, right? So currently in today's world, U.S. Commercial satellite imagers are allowed to take sat squared, imagery, which, interestingly enough, for those of you who don't know the history, we couldn't say sat squared until about 5 years ago or so. Now, to do that and release it unclassified, you have to go get a NOAA license. So there is a licensing process by which commercial industry can go do that. Is that effective? Absolutely not. Does it have any bearing on the question as it was posed? Not really, because if I'm a foreign commercial entity and I go, put a satellite up there, I don't have to go get a NOAA license to go take pictures of things. Now, the question, though, you have to also conflate with the technical capabilities that exist today. So the number of commercial entities that fly in GEO, for example, and can take a high resolution sat squared imagery is pretty much, I think, none right now. There are plans, there are competitions, there are procurements and whatnot, but that is kind of where we are today. So I agree that in the long term, uh, you can't. I don't think there's any way of actually preventing this from happening, and it's just going to get worse and worse and worse. I mean, you can almost look at it like identity theft, right? Everybody assumes that all of our data is already out there, so what are you going to do about it? Because you can't just, keep wishing that it doesn't get stolen.
Thank you. Sean, let me follow up with you on another question. In terms of, we've talked about one of the big gaps today, which is space domain awareness capabilities. And another gap is effective battle management, command control, and communications. In my view, at least, it's still a gap for us. And especially as we move into dynamic maneuver warfare and more offensive space activities and capabilities, and we need to be able to know what's going on in the battle, anticipate what's going to happen, and act accordingly. What do you see as the capabilities that are needed, that should be invested in today in order to be able to enable and implement dynamic maneuver warfare in general, and also on the BMC cubed front? Where are our shortfalls, and what should we do to remedy those shortfalls?
So I think in order to do that effectively, especially as we move further and further out, you're going to need to push a lot of the analysis of that data out, right? So this is one of the few use cases, I would say, it, to my mind, makes sense for on-orbit data centers and whatnot, is that you need to be able to take all of that massive amount of data, and instead of trying to push it down to the Earth, do some analysis, send some commands out over a BMC cube network, and get answers back and forth. It needs to be done out in space, out in orbit, and then beyond as we move further out. That also means we're going to need to enhance our communications links amongst all of the satellites and analytic, data centers or whatnot that are all integrated into a on-orbit infrastructure and a network. And that means really, going to the next generation of comms, high bandwidth, quantum comms. You got to be able to, as much as everybody likes to, fall back on RF as a communication link. The future of laser comm is going to be laser comm networks, quantum communications across those networks, and high bandwidth, because you got a lot of data and you need to have a lot of speed. But that means you're going to have to build these nodes, between LEO to GEO, from GEO to cislunar to lunar, and that's an infrastructure very much like the logistics infrastructure that John was talking about. That's a communications infrastructure to do that. And so I think you need that as far as an infrastructure. You need on-orbit AI to actually help do a lot of the analysis and integration, which means we need to believe in that AI. You need to have autonomy. So you need to have high reliability autonomy that can make use of the answers out of those AI derived tracks, if you will, and do something with it. And we all have to be comfortable with the fact that they're not going to run into each other or to other things. Yeah, I think those are the three main components you're going to need.
Thank you very much. Go ahead, John.
If I just follow up, yeah. So the term dynamic space operations only about 3 years old now, but I think it's it's rapidly deepening. I wouldn't say expanding, but deepening in how we think about it. And a lot of things that Dr. Kirkpatrick just mentioned talk to that. You know, the main idea might be about maneuver of platforms in space, and that might be the central piece. But that by itself is not sufficient any more than tank maneuver in World War II blitzkrieg warfare was by itself sufficient. It was enabled by a lot of combined arms pieces. And I just, as an example, you know, it relied on ground support from aircraft ahead of the tank columns to kind of clear the way. And it relied on, to Dr. Kirkpatrick's point, it relied on radio communications being used in a more tactical and dynamic way than ever before in warfare. And there's more, but those are three key things that had to all come together to really enable armored warfare in World War II. And so I would say that's the same thing. Dynamic space operations is going to probably be headlined by maneuver capability by platforms, but it's going to be enabled by a good communications architecture, using AI tools, logistics that supports it, and other supporting mechanisms that make it all happen. And it has to happen in concert. Can't happen in stovepipes. It has to happen in concert. So it's an exciting time. It's all about this, I think, this paradigm shift that's imminent, and it's kind of exciting.
And at a time where the amount of private equity and venture capital funding going into space is at an all-time high. And so the opportunity to leverage some of that private funding helps enable some of this. And oh, by the way, one thing we haven't mentioned is the fact that the Space Force budget has doubled and more than doubled in the last couple of years, consistent with what the Trump transition team recommended. So a lot more resources. The question is, how best do you apply those looking forward? We are just about out of time. I'd like to give each of you a chance to kind of give some closing comments, if at least in part in your closing comments you would touch again on what you see as some of the real key lessons learned from the conflict we've been in. Currently a ceasefire in place. Let's hope that lasts. But the way U.S. National Security Space Force has performed and lessons for the future. So, John, would you like to go first?
Yeah, I mean, you sort of hit on what I wanted to say, and that is, I think, above all, I'm just really proud of our armed forces and how professional and how capable they are. You know,
Amazing.
It is, and we have to remember that we have the best military force, the most capable, the one most capable of using initiative, being professional, learning, a learning organization, making it better the next time. Then I would venture to say it's probably the best in history. And I'm really proud to have led many of those warfighters when I'm in active duty. I'm proud to see it playing out now, and I think I hope that the American public appreciates and recognizes that, because it's an amazing thing.
Thank you. Sean?
Yeah, similarly, and I guess I would even echo not only what John said, but I would emphasize something that the American public will never see, and that is the intelligence community's contributions to this.
Absolutely.
You know, it is often been a source of frustration for me to see my people not get recognized for the extraordinary work they would do in support of any sort of conflict or challenge, and not be able to stand up and you know, shout how wonderful they were. And I think it's worth noting that the military successes, the political successes, everything that is accomplished is done so by the information provided by the intelligence community. Now, whether or not people will listen to that is a different question. That's not our role as intelligence officers. We don't have a choice in that, right? Our job is to get the data, get the information, whether that's strategic information or tactical information, and make sure it is of the highest quality and it is justifiable and it is defendable and it is evidentiary based. And then we provide that to the warfighter, to the decision makers, to whomever, and it is how they use it. And I think you see, because the military is so well integrated with, you know, that intelligence apparatus and infrastructure and all those personnel that are co-deployed with all of those people, they do an outstanding job of actioning all of that information and intelligence.
Absolutely. And just before we wrap up here, I would say personally, thank you to both of you for appearing today. Thank you very much, and thank you for your service in the government. You both had very distinguished careers, and I would just also say, praise God that although we lost life, cherished life in the conflict. I'm very proud of our men and women in uniform. They couldn't have done a better job. They made us all proud, and we should be proud of the sacrifices that they make on our behalf. So unfortunately, we're out of time. Thank you again, General Shaw and Dr. Kirkpatrick, for sharing your insights with us today. Thank you as well to the small but mighty NSSA staff, Kayla, Alyssa, Sean, and Jeff. You are truly the best in the business. Please visit the NSSA website. That's nssaspace.org for more information on upcoming activities and events. We have a very busy schedule planned over the remainder of the year, including multiple signature series events focused on space threats and acquisition, international space cooperation, and much more. Well, that's it for today's SpaceTime interview. John, Sean, thank you again. Really appreciate it. And have a great day, everyone. We'll see you again
Thanks, Chris.
soon.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you.
Bye, John.